Hello, and welcome to the latest in the Oxford Development Talk series. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Masooda Bano. Masooda is Professor of Development Studies in the Oxford Department of International Development, and she's going to focus on the very important and obviously timely topic of Islam in the changing world. And there are a few people I can think of better placed to focus on this topic. Masooda's research focuses on the intersection of Islamic authority with questions of age and gender, and looks at change in the Islamic world through the prism of both ideational questions and also material questions. So she's author of a number of highly acclaimed books that look at many of these themes. For instance, The Rational Believer, Choices and Decisions in the Madrasas of Pakistan, published by Cornell University Press, and Female Islamic Education Movements, published by Cambridge University Press. So Masooda's going to aim to speak for about 30 minutes or so. She's got a slide-based presentation, and then we'll open up for an interactive Q&A session. And if you think of questions while Masooda's talking, feel free to just enter them in the chat box, and then we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. And we'll aim to finish within the hour so you can all get on with your busy days. But thank you very much for joining us, and Masooda, delighted to have you with us. It's all yours.
Thanks, Alex, for the introduction, and also, in fact, for suggesting the title for this talk, because I think it gives me a good way to bring together a lot of my different strands of my research, which I'll briefly share today. So let me share my screen first. Sorry, one second. What has happened with share? As you have to give me a minute, I think my screen has disappeared.
That's fine. Just clicking on share screen.
Yeah.
And then it takes just a minute of a spinning wheel going round and round, and then hopefully it will appear before everyone's eyes.
Yes, I found it. So do you think you can see it now?
Yes, just go. Yeah, perfect.
That's lovely. So the fact that I was saying that the title itself is interesting, which you propose, in fact, is this: that if we start with the starting assumption about Islam or religion per se as a subject of study, the assumption is that it's something that is unchanging. So things around could be changing, but why focus on religion when religion is normally, or ideologies in general, are seen to be resistant to change? In fact, they are one thing in this changing sort of world, or even historically, which were meant to give certainty to people, a bit of sense of stability. And that's how religion has always been seen as something that helps you cope with things. So when everything else could be changing, it offers you some absolute facts about life, about existence, about reality. So, why expect anything to change within Islam, even if things around might be changing? So, and this in particular, like I said, it applies to all study of all religions or ideologies, and that's why traditionally ideology was seen more as more of a structural thing, studied more by sociologists and anthropologists, where it's more fixed, it's given, and you work within that, rather than studying it more from the individualist kind of approach, which is the kind of approach I take, where you try to understand why people choose to believe. You give them a bit of agency when you study religion now. So that's the kind of tradition I work within and I'll represent today. But in general, just to go back to the rigidity expected from religion, this particularly applies to study of Islam, and especially in the last 20-year kind of history, starting with September 11, that there's been this understanding that Islam is a very rigid tradition, especially starting with September 11, with this focus on militancy, radicalization, and the argument being, the reason this kind of position has been a bit easy for some scholars to advocate, is this: that all textual tradition, of course, have a primary text, whether it's Bible for Christianity or Torah for Judaism. But Quran has slight distinction, the main, the book that the Muslims believe, because Muslims have a very unquestioning conviction. I mean, if you are a Muslim, you believe in this, that Quran is the unchanged word of God. So it's something that that's absolutely what was the word of God, never changed by any human intervention. So then if you take that kind of historical baggage of Islam along, then as a social science scholar, there's quite a bit of argument you can make that, see, if the texts are arguing for jihad, then some people are simply, believers are simply following that text. So a lot of emphasis, one kind of debate has put on Islam's rigidity and shown it as a radical militant text, because some verses in the Quran can outrightly seem anti-Jew, anti-Christian, and in favor of militancy. Similarly, and this is not just for the jihad and radicalization that this kind of argument has been used about Islam, even in broader, more sort of thematic study of Islam in anthropology, religion, which again looks quite a bit at religious behavior. We have a lot of influential work which would say that Islam is is very, not anti, but it's very sort of effective. In fact, it's seen as a positive thing for those who believe that it's good at resisting secularization. So unlike Christianity, which underwent reform and the liberal tradition that emerges in the West, in Muslim societies you don't see that happening, and even in future with education and progressive sort of values coming, the separation, a clear separation between state and religion seems unlikely. That's the kind of assumption that holds generally. And also in terms of there's a lot of interest right now in second, third generation Muslims in the West, and again the primary lens that the sociologists are interested in is the persistence of religiosity. So the expectation being that if you're born and raised here in a Western liberal culture, you'll absorb the local values, and slowly we'll see Islam becoming a secondary kind of force. There'll be a bit of secularization of attitude. But generally, a lot of longitudinal, not longitudinal, but intergenerational data that sociologists are gathering shows that religiosity remains very high in second and third generation Muslims. So with all of this, the assumption that, things could be changing, but what relevance does it have for study of Islam? There is a bit of justification for that. But having said it, that was like a bit more of the historical kind of legacy of study of religion, which many carry on even today, who argue Islam is very textual and rigid. The other strand of research, which is equally active now, and that's why even scholars like me sitting in development studies study religion quite actively, is this, that we see that ideologies, whether secular ideologies, Marxism or any like that, or religion, there's enough evidence to show that they are not as rigid as assumed. And they always adapt. Of course, there's limit to which you can adapt. If you give up all your ideas, then you stand for nowhere, and the power of that ideology or religious belief that brought people to you, you lose that. But having said that, at the same time, historically, all religious tradition, we have enough evidence that over centuries, if you look at them, their progression, they all adapt at different times according to the needs of the society, according to the beliefs of the people, if they have to have loyal followers. Because the practical application, the relevance of the religious belief does make a difference. Like, it adds to its value. This is the kind of work I've done a lot to show that a lot of time beliefs matter, because people say, oh, but it works for me. When I'm in the fieldwork, they'll always say, Islam says this, but see, in my actual life, I saw it. So the relevance part of it, I feel really matters. In my own work, I see that too. And secondly, in general, we are seeing that there's a lot of research, even within this individual actor kind of research, which comes more from economics and rational choice kind of theory, where there's a growing interest in informal institutions. The traditional assumption in development studies or field like development economics was a lot of focus on state institution, on markets, and like the formal institutions of governance. But now there's a very strong strand which is saying that no, informal institutions like belief, social, cultural norms, religious beliefs, they matter, because in fact they matter sometimes even more, because they shape people. If you believe, then it could shape every aspect of your life, even an economic decision, whether you take mortgage or not. For a Muslim, a believing Muslim is a very religious decision, because Islam has do's and don'ts about riba, which is interest. Because it forbids riba, which is interest. So if you're really believing Muslim, whether to take a mortgage or not is a big dilemma for you. So it can be actually the influence of religious belief then can be, or an informal institution can be very wide ranging, even more than a formal institution. And finally, just to challenge the assumption that Islam is particularly rigid, is this, that unlike the popular, especially media driven kind of perception of Islam, The reality is that Islam as a religious tradition, it's very textual, which is its strength partly because it has a strong legacy and educated people engage with it and get convinced of its reasoning, partly because there's a rich text that justifies different arguments and reasoning. But at the same time, it has this a specific tool, methodological tool, which is called ijtihad. Of course, I won't give a big lecture on ijtihad for this audience, but those with a bit of a Muslim background would intuitively, immediately understand it. But even for the wider audience, the simple concept is that Islam gives Islamic law the freedom to adapt to time. In fact, there's a lot of emphasis on Islam, that Islam is for all times. So because it's for all time, there's a realization Islamic law or legal tradition has to be adapted in the context of the time. So there's a lot of flexibility within the tradition. So all of that challenges the assumption that, there's rigidity in Islam, and that's why we see a very violent Islam in modern times. So against all this, what happened was that, and that's what I'll share my main findings and research for today, is that in the last 5 years, I led a team project, funded quite generously by European Research Council, which was actually titled Changing Structures of Islamic Authority and Social Change. And the assumption for that was precisely this, what I've explained, that I was, based on I do a lot of ethnographic fieldwork in many different Muslim countries. That's my strength. Not many academics get to do that. So in Middle East, South Asia, even East Asia. So I've done primary fieldwork. And even before starting this project, which looks at these Islamic scholarly platforms and their debates, what I was seeing was that whether I was in Jakarta, whether I was in Cairo or Islamabad, the capitals of some of the major Muslim countries, the attitudes of the youth were changing. And it's because and this starting from the turn of the century, is this that the globalization of media, internet, TV channels, where Netflix kind of networks, where everybody is seeing, even youth in those countries, educated youth is seeing the same shows as being shown here. And even especially the mobile technology as well, the mobile apps, they're making a dramatic difference and in the attitudes of the young. And there's a very globalized, they could be believing Muslim. Nobody that I was interviewing at that time wanted to leave Islam, but they all were of the view that Islam adapts to time, and the modern times aesthetics are different, and we want Islamic scholars to adapt. And I think that the biggest example of that, I'll mention briefly, is actually coming from Saudi Arabia, which some of you might be actually reading in the media too. The most rigid of Islamic states, where the Sharia was being imposed sort of in quite a brute, like in a very blatant kind of a way, not a very nuanced way, not what those who do ijtihad would argue is the right way for today, but in a quite a rigid textual kind of a way. But now in the last 2 years, a major shift in state policies, and very dramatic ones, opening up of giving women the rights, the driving rights, all these rights which were very basic but were being denied. And that's a country I do a lot of primary fieldwork too. And it's the same thing. The young educated generation is changing, and the state was realizing you have to adapt. So and the scholars are under pressure and they are adapting. So, but that's how they adapt and why they adapt is the kind of issue I'll discuss more. But similarly, in terms of the things that made me realize that the context for the Muslims is changing, and as a result, I expected the scholars will have pressure to adapt, and which is what we tested in that project. And I do show in that all the work that we did in that project shows that scholars are really adapting because they realize that you lose the young otherwise. So the other fact before I move to the results is this, that the second and third generation Muslims in the West, again, based on my primary work, I was seeing are changing too in their attitudes. Not all, but a lot of them are now better integrated than the parent generation. Parents came more as migrant workers. Some of the children from those very families have done well in education. They have gone to best of universities, are working in the city, in London or New York. So they want an Islam that relates to their modern reality. And again, so a lot of pressure on the scholars to give them an Islam that relates to modernity, rather than being always in opposition or a radical Islam, which seems to be so anti-West, a culture and society that a lot of Muslims appreciate today or enjoy today. And finally, another thing I was finding in terms of changing context is that September 11 brought a lot of negative press to Islam. So as a result, when I was doing interviews, I realized it has there's been one positive outcome of that too, which is this, that young Muslims across, like whether in the West or Muslim majority countries, were much more self-reflective of their religion. So some would say that, oh, as a result of reading the Quran, they actually got disturbed and left it. There are a few examples like that, or like became doubtful about their religion. But majority would respond that they, after reading this negative press about their religion all the time, they decided to study Islam more seriously. And when they studied it, they found that actually it's quite a progressive tradition, which allows for adaptability to time while retaining your basic moral code. So just to now briefly explain to you the project, what I show at the top of the slide is the link to the website, which also shares some of the results from the finding, because the project finished in December. So all the research sort of main arguments are there. All the publications that came out are listed there if you are interested to follow them. But basically, just to explain the methodology, it was a 5-year project with multi-team, and part of my team was social scientists, of course, like me, but the other part was Islamic textual scholars, like they were postdocs who had PhDs in Islamic studies, because the project had twofold focus. You had to look at Islamic text to see the debates of the contemporary scholars, like what are they saying about mortgage, on economic issues, what Muslims should do or not do, on gender, this whole issue that women must wear hijab or they must always be segregated. A part of the historical Islamic tradition is very firm on that, but another part of traditional scholars, another group would say, no, there's adaptability given the context. So, there are all these debates. So gender, environment, finance, and education. So there were multiple sort of issues that we looked at, which are contemporary modern issues, social science issues, on which we want to do policy making as well, but through the lens of the scholars. So that was one part. And second part, more for the social science researcher, was to see why young Muslims follow one tradition, say a more progressive one, than a more conservative one, which has clear policy kind of implications. So just to explain, in the Muslim majority countries, we look at the project looked at 4 very major Islamic scholarly establishments, which produce texts that, or whose scholars argue, present arguments that affect decisions of young Muslims or believing Muslims on what is right, what is wrong. Here I have to just briefly mention that Islam, unlike Christianity, does not have a hierarchical structure. So that's why this Islamic scholarly establishment, where scholars set the ulama, the word for them is ulama, and argue about what Islamic legal tradition says or not says, become very influential. There's nothing like a pope in Islam. But these institutions, on the other hand, have a lot of influence. So, and this is Sunni Islam I'm working on. Shia Islam does have a bit of a hierarchy, which is comparable to Catholic kind of hierarchy. So in the Muslim Sunni world, we looked at Al-Azhar, a very leading Islamic scholarly establishment in Egypt, established in 9th century. So we are talking about one of the oldest universities actually in the world. Then Deoband is a South Asian tradition, very influential among British Muslims because most of them are from South Asia. Saudi Salafism, which is from Saudi Arabia, and Diyanat, which is a Turkish tradition, and it's reviving quite actively under the present day Turkey political, sort of Islamist political kind of orientation. And in these ones, I have to mention that Al-Azhar and Diyanat are historically represent the more sort of progressive is a word I have to use very carefully because many people won't like it, and in my writing I don't use it because in writing you can qualify things in a more easier way and pin them down better. Verbally, to make it accessible to all of you from different backgrounds, I'm using the word progressive, but question me on it later if you want. But yes, progressive to say that here, these are the traditions which were always more adaptive to local context. So less focused on the textual rigidity, but to say, okay, fine, this Quran says this, but it says interpret in context of your time and historical legacy. So, allowing for much more adaptability to local context and socially a bit more progressive too. So Al-Azhar and Diyanat, the Egyptian and the Turkish tradition represent that, while Deoband and Saudi Salafism are seen to be very textual, very rigid, socially very conservative. And so that's for the selection. We look at both some of the progressive institutions and the very conservative ones as well. Saudi Salafism is the one blamed most for jihad. Deoband is also blamed a bit for that because they seem to be very close-minded in their approach. And Deoband is really anti any kind of social mixing among women, which seem to be to retard their progress. So that's the background of these institutions. And at the same time, the project was 5-year generous funding. So we also looked at the Muslims in the Western context. So it's a good project looking at both developing world and and what's happening to Muslims and Muslim scholarly traditions in the West. And here, of course, a lot of the traditional, there's growing work on Muslims in the West, and for the last 20 years, a lot has been published, and most of it focuses on these extensions of the institutions I've just mentioned in the past slide, how they've mushroomed over time in the Western context. Migrating Muslims brought their religious beliefs, and these brought their imams gradually, got permissions, got the imams, established mosque, and very conservative mosque, which propagate very conservative Islam. That kind of work exists. Like in the UK, again, the Dewan madrasas are seen to be the primary base for educating Muslim about Islam, and again, very orthodox. So promoting social values which put Muslims, in opposition to the majority culture. So we said, okay, fine, we look at some of those, what's happening within them, but the team actively looked for institutions where there was sign that the scholars are producing something more adaptive to the local context, because of course there was work coming out on them too. So again, I don't have too much time to go into all of them, but a number of institutions: Cambridge Muslim College in Cambridge, established by Tim Winter, a white Muslim convert; Zaytuna College, again established by a white American convert in Berkeley, two very influential institutions, reviving very sort of what I'm calling in my most recent book, more like rationalistic scholarship, more mystical and rationalistic sides of Islam, the earlier text. While Tariq Ramadan, who was a professor at Oxford, is leading another kind of approach to say that Islamic legal law can be adapted to modern reality, while staying loyal to the tradition. So all these institutions, we have worked on them, on what the scholars are saying. My postdocs did that. We have 2 volumes with Edinburgh University Press listed on the website if you're interested. And we give you a good analysis of what the scholars, what are these institutions historically, what is their relationship with the state or society. That's the kind of chapters I did, while my postdocs did more work on comparing the actual textual legal positions of these scholars. And what we are finding actually in these volumes, what we show you is that across this tradition, even the 2 most conservative ones, the Saudi Salafism one and the one, scholars are under a lot of pressure. They realize they lose the youth if they don't adapt the religious discourse to the needs of the time. For example, very simple example, the one tradition, like I just said, the South Asian one, very conservative. If you look at the parent Deoband Madrasa, the first one that was established in Saharanpur in India, on their website, they list some of the fatwas. Fatwas is the answers that the scholar gives to questions young Muslims, I keep saying young Muslim, that anyone might ask. And one of the questions that when we were analyzing, say, gender debate on that one was that should Muslim women, remember Saharanpur is rural, where that madrasa, parent madrasa is still based, it's very big, but it's still the population that comes to this madrasa is still very rural and orthodox. So the question being asked is that should women, if co-education is the only option available in the country, pursue university education, or if they cannot have segregated classes, they should avoid it. Or similarly, another kind of question that if going for education requires traveling through an area where, where women is not seen to be safe, can she go without a mahram, like a male guardian? And on all these positions, if you look at Al-Azhar and Diyanat, the other 2 traditions, they're giving you much more progressive answers that education is the priority as long as the woman behaves in reasonable manner. If it's joint education, she pursues it, she just takes care of her moral behavior. While Deoband, on the other hand, a very conservative tradition, is still today saying that no, women, in this kind of context, women should let go of those economic opportunities because their morality is more important, something like that. So the thing is that, and so one of the political economy kind of analysis I give you in that volume is that what is very interesting is that Deoband can take that position because its following is still coming from a lot of this rural, low income kind of population where for them the reality is a bit like that. So foregoing a bit of those opportunities is not that big a challenge. But as soon as you move towards the urban centers, even the Deoband scholars, and that's what we are showing you, just to go back to the screen, Ibrahim College, based in London, is one of those kind of examples. And we have examples like that even in Muslim majority countries, where even Deobandi scholars away from the parent madrasa are now saying, no, these kind of things have to be adapted. Women have to be allowed because that's what the need of the society are. So there's quite a bit of adaptability, but the challenge remains for all scholars, and that's not just for Islam, but for anybody who represents an ideology or a religious belief, is that if you go too far in change, then you lose all credibility. And that's where my starting slide is still relevant, which is this, that you come to religion with an absolute faith, otherwise it doesn't work. You can only get the rewards of being a believer, and that's something I explore quite a bit in The Rational Believer, when you look at individual rationality, why believe? So it only makes sense to believe if you have conviction, because if you don't put faith in it, then what's the point? Because the whole thing of religion is that it elevates your fears, it removes them, it gives you certain comfort, you believe in the otherworldly rewards, you didn't get this, but you'll get something there in return. So if there's no conviction in it, and if the scholars keeps changing the basic principles of it, then it loses that stability and conviction it gives to people. So the art of this, for any reform tradition, is to, and for the scholars, good scholars, is to maintain the core and innovate around the core, and that's what we're finding, that a lot of that is happening. I don't have time to go into this because this will require a bit of prior Islamic knowledge, but just to give you the terms like fiqh al-waqi, fiqh al-aqliyat. Fiqh al-waqi is means a law of reality, like what's relevant. Fiqh al-aqliyat, fiqh is the Islamic word for law, fiqh al-aqliyat means minority law. So that's a lot of Islamic law being adapted to Muslims in minority. So a lot of scholars are saying mortgage in the West is fine, they're telling Muslims, because that's, given that you're a minority in this context, you have to follow rules of the given context. So, they provide certain rationality, a deeper kind of rationality within that. Because if that's the only way to save your family's well-being, you do it. You don't do it for profit, but you do it for that. And similarly, Maqasid Sharia. This is again a more liberal position, which Tariq Ramadan, the scholar based at Oxford, promoted quite a bit, which says that we don't have to sort of follow the specifics of the law that the early scholars might have interpreted, but we can reinterpret, because basically, eventually, there are 6 basic principles of Sharia, Islamic law, which are not very different, to be honest, from basic human right laws, like respect of life, respect of property, respect of religion, those kind of principles. So so they say that once you follow those basic principles, the rest of the detail is up to the needs of the time. So the scholars, they have the permission to do ijtihad, they should adapt. So in the books we give you, if you're interested, just have a look at the 2 volumes from Edinburgh University Press, listed at the project website, and you can have, they're quite thick volumes, and you can have the details of this. And just to mention, I won't go too much into it, but even in the West, we categorize like these, find the majority of the people might still be going to this Orthodox madrasa and these Deoband mosques and all. But a lot of the young Muslims, especially university going Muslims, we are finding them following these other institutions that I mentioned, and we categorize that conceptually into 3 types of institutions that are emerging. One are looking at the neo-traditionalists, which is like this Tim Winter, Hamza Yusuf, the converts, which are helping revive the traditional Islamic scholarship, mystical, deep metaphysical kind of debates, and quite a bit on logic, which was part of the early Islamic tradition. I don't have the time to go into it today, but basically the bigger argument in Islamic history is, intellectual history, is that the colonial period led to disappearance for a lot of this progressive kind of Islamic learning traditions, and gave way to very sort of textual tradition, because when everything was changing, again, a context where everything was changing, Muslims were losing all political power, Muslim empires, in favor of colonial rule. So the scholars said, what can they do best? And they thought what they can preserve best is the textual tradition, because the more you allow philosophy and mysticism and all of that come in, more the chance you might lose the core itself. So there's quite a bit of debate, and I take the same position, that colonial rule actually led to, and which is actual fact, led to birth of conservative movements like Deoband and Salafism. They actually physically emerged, like the origin is attributable to that period. They took birth then. While this more traditional, the earlier Islam was very sort of deeper philosophical kind of debates. And then there you go neo-legalists like Tariq Ramadan, who are sort of looking at sort of specific Sharia debates. And then even Salafi, like neoconservatives are like people like Salafi scholars who are trained in Al-Madina in university in Saudi Arabia, which is seen to be promoting, Salafism globally. And yet today, based in America, Yasir Qadhi is taking very sort of moderate positions, which are enabling young Muslims to say, you can be a confident Muslim, but you can be a loyal American too. And in fact, you can contribute something to the society by bringing certain values in, which were part of early Christianity today, Christian moral fabric too. So so there's a lot of positive stuff happening. And on this one, I think I'll speak for another 5 to 7 minutes and then try to leave more time for question answers. But on this one, the book, which is again listed there too, which is the last major. I mean, we have another volume coming on Future of Selfism, but that's an edited volume resulting from a conference. But in terms of my own major work, the last monograph from that book project is already out, which is on a revival of Islamic rationalism, logic, metaphysics, and mysticism in contemporary Muslim societies. And this book is actually a very in-depth ethnographic work spread over 4 or 5 years of this project with the scholars, like I said, from Zaytuna College and Cambridge Muslim College and other network of scholars linked to this network, like Rosales Institution in southern Spain, in Granada, led by Muslim converts again. Reverts, they say, because they say their forefathers were Muslims. But basically showing that how these networks, those initiated by a lot of white converts and all, is today in attracting a lot of young Muslims, and young Muslims from the leading Western universities. So from Harvard, their followers are sitting in Harvard, like young Muslims, in Cambridge, in Oxford. That's how I got interested in this loop quite a bit, and I then attended a lot of retreats with them. And it's a growing network, and the best part of this network is that it's bringing young Muslims back to serious study of Islamic text, and already that second to third generation, and in the third of scholars produced by this network, and the third generation is second generation Muslims, majority. There are very few converts in it. So that's in fact is a sign that in fact this movement is becoming very mainstream among educated Muslims in the West. And also I show you in the book, in the last chapter, that even in the Muslim majority countries, these kind of networks have an increasing resonance with the liberal, urban youth, educated youth, universities and colleges. And the best part, again, historically linking back, I say is that that they're bringing the young educated Muslim youth back to the study of Islamic text, and that has remarkable implication. I mean, that's a big argument. Again, you need to read the book to fully understand. But in a way, texts are interpreted, because briefly explaining conceptually, when we talk about production of knowledge, there's this theory about something called tacit knowledge, or call it lay knowledge. Some people like to use that word, versus specialist knowledge. So you could be a scholar of a tradition, but you also, whether a religious tradition or any kind of social science kind of tradition, if you think of it, when you come to your specialist knowledge, you bring your upbringing, your background, your knowledge with it. So, the environment you grew up in, the kind of knowledge you have of other realities of life, which is a lived experience. You can't just read it in the books. There's that emphasis on tacit knowledge. And anthropologists, like sociologists like Polanyi and to Douglas North in institutional economics, they all have engaged, like different traditions have engaged with this tacit knowledge or lay knowledge kind of concept. And I engage with it too. And the argument I'm trying to make through there is that when the educated Muslim who left the Islamic scholarly tradition, we have enough evidence to show that during the colonial period in favor of Western institutions, leaving it all to the poor and the marginalized, that's the kind of population your scholars, a lot of scholars in Muslim country, Islamic scholars come from. Like in the last at least century. So now to have people who are actually part of the leading institutions, believing Muslim, and who are pursuing their fields as doctor, philosopher, Western philosophy, whatever, but are also engaging seriously with classical Islamic texts on mysticism and philosophy, is rekindling a very vibrant Islamic scholarly tradition. And it's small yet, but it's having reach in the Muslim majority world too. That's why in the book actually take the position that this century will be known more for, although it started with Islamic radical jihad, like Islam being labeled as radical, jihadi kind of religion. My take is that another 20, 30 years, and actually this century will be known for revival of Islamic rationalist scholarship, not in fact jihad, like that would have become a past. Because I see a lot of appeal among young Muslims for these kind of movements in both sides. So issues for social planners, just looking at my watch, is this that the issue is not that Islam is not relevant to modernity. To sum it up simply, it's a contentious debate, but this assumption that Islam is inherently a radical religion, or Muslim societies are bound to stay this way because their religion dictates women to stay at home, or all these kind of things. We have enough evidence that scholars across the tradition, even Deoband and Salafism, like I've showed you example, from the tradition as a whole might still be orthodox, but many from within this tradition are moving towards more reasonable reasoning. and arguing for adaptability. So there's enough scholarly work out there to, and in fact, like I'm saying, growing evidence is that there's more of the scholars are producing more of this kind of work, which is more adaptable, allowing Muslim to make modern choices and be loyal to their religion. The issue is not that Islam is not giving you modern choices. It's the issue is that why are many young Muslims still choosing, and there's a choice element here, choosing to follow the more textually rigid or oppositional kind of scholarship, which puts Muslim against the West. So why are we still sort of having to deal with a lot of young second generation or third generation French or British or German Muslims who see themselves as opposed to their home society because they're born there. And over there, I think we have, again, a lot of research and a lot of evidence piling up that this is primarily, the choices, that kind of choice is primarily a result of the social, political, and economic choices or the marginalization a lot of these people feel. Of course, there's a bit of crime and that kind of behavior too, perverse behavior that contributes to violence and all too. But we're talking about mainstream kind of Muslims who are still like not belonging to their societies, their host societies. They feel alien to them. And over there, so I think a lot of it is about, and that's where social science comes in. It's not just a textual analysis. We know texts are giving people modern choices. Why are people not taking those choices? Why are they wanting to choose to stay in opposition? Is a question for social scientists and policymakers to consider. And finally, Alex, just to take one more minute, is this that one last question you could ask is that, if you look at the Muslim majority world as well as the Western governments, a lot of them have tried to reform Islam, like do the same things that I've covered for you before, like adaptability and all of that, with the view that, oh, let's make Islam modern. And this was not just Western governments starting after September 11. Muslim majority world, post-colonial leaders, they followed the psyche of the colonial legacy, and they all believe madrasas and all are in need of reform. Religion is a hurdle to modernity and progress because they were all trying to ape the former colonial masters. So a lot of them have Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, many countries, Egypt and all. They all tried, the state very actively tried to modernize these Islamic scholarly establishments, to make them give more modern Islam to people. But all of them have historically, majority have failed in their attempt, partly because all these efforts, whether we see the Muslim majority world, again, I work on that and compared to, or we look at what state governments are doing in the West. Say Germany, for example, established a theological Islam, like department, Islamic theology departments post-September 11, thinking that might be one way to have more progressive Islam. France is doing these French imam kind of training courses, but none of them, whatever research we have coming out in them, are building credibility with the public and Muslim population. People are still going to the Orthodox institution. And the problem there is twofold. One is trust. People don't trust these efforts. They think that it's a way to sort of just eliminate Islam gradually from their lives, which is true partly because whether Muslim majority countries or the Western governments, they want to secularize these institutions rather than, make them revive some philosophical, intellectual Islam. They just rather minimize Islam rather than, revive it in any intellectual way. One problem is that, but secondly, I also feel based primarily on my work in Bangladesh and Pakistan with these madrasa reform programs, is this that there's a genuine technical problem too. The bureaucrats and all are coming from, like I say, from modern institutions. Very few of them have studied ever in madrasa, all of that. So they carry the same bias that, oh, these institutions are close-minded, we have to reform them. So without even engaging with the scholar, they come up with these reform efforts and curriculums which just don't make sense. And there's not enough people to teach those kind of curriculums. So I think states are failing, but that's not to say I would say that they shouldn't make an effort. I think what they can do is to identify some of these sort of these reformist platforms. Let's not even call the word reform because a lot of Muslim scholars don't like it, but who are reviving, let's call it, the intellectual, the spiritual sort of dimensions of Islam, and strengthen them rather than trying to impose, these very modern alien kind of ideas of reform on these institutions. So I see much more hope for Islam in this changing context than some others might. I'll finish with that, Alex, and hand over to you.
Masooda, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. Fascinating substantively, but also fascinating in terms of the underlying approach to social science and its intersection with the humanities in your work, and I'm sure we could explore that. One of the things that's most striking for me is your starting point, suggesting that religious beliefs and identities are not fixed, they're not rigid, they're subject to interpretation and change, and that they can be changed. They can actively, and in some cases instrumentally, be changed by educational institutions, by scholars, by thinkers, by intellectuals, but that there are limits to this. There are limits to how far they can be changed and who can do the changing in terms of trust, legitimacy, and other constraints. I wondered if you could say something before we open up to broader questions from the audience about what characteristics you see in successful, if you like, in the language I would use in political science, norm entrepreneurs. What are the characteristics of people who can successfully change and shape Islam, whether top down or bottom up, whether as individuals or as institutions? Who's good at this and who's bad at this? Who succeeds, who fails, and why?
Question. First of all, you've given a very good summary, so you listen very carefully, it shows, which I'm glad, because you gave a very good summary of what I was trying to argue. And on this one, norm entrepreneurs, Alex, if we look at all the scholars which are having big following and are still are retaining credibility while adapting, they are the ones. One thing is very essential: they have to be trained in a classical Islamic school of call it law or Islamic education, because they have to show that they have knowledge of the text. A lot of problem with, say, some of these Islamic feminists, university-based kind of women scholars emerging from 1970s, who have argued a lot about, Quran is not restrictive of women. It's because the male scholars interpreted it, so that's why it's restrictive. Let's reinterpret the Quran. But those efforts have never gone far. They've never built the credibility. So the example of those who fail to win credibility is this, because they never are able to show that they were classically trained. They know that they have the knowledge enough of the text to first of all say, I know it well, and then I have the credibility and a bit of moral living by it, because that goes by. I think religion has more of it than but even ideology I think would have it, because a Marxist living a very lavish lifestyle out of the movement's money won't have any followers. So similarly, because Islam requires a certain moral code, all of that, so the scholars who establish, like they know the classical text, when they speak to the public, a lot of them would refer very easily to Quranic verses, so all that to establish that I have the knowledge, and also morally I'm living a bit by that. Like, just to give an example, Tariq Ramadan, the French Islamic scholar, he never claimed to be living by Islamic moral standards. He's slightly different than the other preachers. But still, people still had expectation of certain moral credibility. So whatever happened has eroded his credibility among the followers. So those things happen. But otherwise, primary thing is authority building is show the knowledge of the text, sound knowledge of the text, have a moral character, broadly living by those sort of kind of beliefs, and then using sort of adapting to a context where there are certain cores which we can argue are core. I mean, there are ways to find that. So they don't touch that, as long because, for example, there are 4 Sunni legal schools which are very influential historically. So those scholars who don't touch the very core debates, but are able to move around it, are the most effective. If you start changing the core itself, and core often is determined what is in the Quran itself. So if you start changing that, then it's very easy to lose credibility. There is, in fact, a group called Progressive Muslims, and they have a very small number, primarily because of this, because people think they just go too far. So, so there are ways to limit, but knowing your stuff and living a bit by it, I think is quite important to building credibility.
Brilliant. We've got quite a few questions coming in, so I'll read a couple to you. There's 2, I think, that come from someone from, it says BSG, so I'm guessing perhaps someone at the Blavatnik School of Government. First of all, they say, thank you for such a thought-provoking talk. And they've got 2 questions. I think the first is really about change from inside Muslim societies compared to change from the outside, asking in a way, can change be affected from outside Islam? Can there be lessons for people who want to affect that change externally? I think you've touched on that in both your analysis and what you've just said, but there's certainly some interest in what this means for people outside the religion and outside Islamic regions. And the second question from that person is about whether you think attitudes towards Islam will change in light of the current global agenda, particularly the growth in transnational issues like climate change, the pandemic, etc. Do you think that sort of sense of globalization or international solidarity will change attitudes to Islam in any particular ways?
So for the first one, I'm less optimistic about change from outside, partly again because the issue becomes of credibility. As soon as the external, the outside element comes, there's an extra effort. It's not that it cannot be done, but I think there's an extra effort required to build credibility. And again, I'll give you a bit more example from the specific example that comes to my mind is the women rights NGOs in Muslim countries, these very feminist ones, the one which are funded a lot by the Western donors with a view to promote, Muslim women rights and all of that. And these have the least credibility eventually in the society, even among educated kind of Muslim women, partly because they're seen as foreign agenda. So, so it's not that it cannot be done, but I think you have to be just very extra careful when you are an outsider, because people are starting with a sense of distrust about your intentions. So you have to be, in fact, extra careful partly, which a lot of these NGOs eventually are not, because they opt for very feminist agendas, and then, they lose credibility. So that's the answer to the first one. But I think it has to be case specific. And if you give me a specific case, I might give you some suggestions, advice on how I think you can make, even as an outsider, make it sell, but that's different. But secondly, for the second one about, Alex, remind me, the second question was briefly, what were we?
It was about whether the transnational global issues change attitudes to Islam.
I have a feeling that it might, because like I'm giving you a more positive outlook for the way I feel Islamic sort of movements are evolving in future. And I have a feeling that yes, it might, partly because, even the young Muslims are becoming much more active in these movements. So the graduates of the Athuna College or Cambridge Muslim College, they're very active in promoting environmental friendly movements, because that's part of the kind of teaching they're getting a lot in these institutions. So I have a feeling these kind of eco-friendly movements or organic farming movements, those are kind of things they're very keen on, because Islam is about good. Food is one of the very important parts. It should be, no harm to the animal, no harm to the environment, all those concerns are there. So those platforms could be places where a lot of these young Muslims actively come forward, especially those in the West, because they're well placed to do it. Do you understand? If you're sitting a graduate student in Harvard or Chicago or Oxford, you can make your voice heard and media can cover you. So do you understand? So the impression starts changing. There's a chance.
There's another question we've got about what is your view on Muslim movements, for instance, the Deobandi in the context of India that you mentioned, rejecting so-called liberal Muslims, such as Bollywood stars, for not being true to Islam, such as because of their dancing, their music, etc., and therefore preventing liberalization or rationalizing of Islamic culture. So how do you look at and understand those more quote unquote conservative Muslim movements?
This is the one I have to be slightly careful how I phrase it, because it's not my opinion, but I'm trying to tell you honestly how they deal with it. And this applies not just to Deoband. I'll give you an example for this, because this is linked up to your question about building credibility. Like if you're a norm change, you're an entrepreneur, how do you retain credibility while you're trying to take the population with you? And singing, dancing is again one of those which is very fundamentally linked, because with Islam, you have to remember that the Prophet lived led a society. He was not just a preacher, he led a whole society. He was a leader of the city of Medina for the 10-15 years he was there. So there are certain social ways of living which are known. So dancing and singing is one of those where majority would, do you understand, a consensus that's not Islam. At best you can have a bit of drum beats or that classical kind of stuff, nothing more. So if a Deobandi scholar or even a liberal sort of Cambridge-based scholar starts saying that that's allowed, you start eroding credibility. Do you understand? So there are these challenges, and the most tangible one, which is sensitive, but I'll mention because they have to face it all the time on media, is what do you say to gay Muslims who say that we are Muslim too, let us be in your mosque and all, because Islam is very sort of clear on it that it's not. So I think Hamza Yusuf, the convert, gave the best answer to that in one of the media interviews. He said that I cannot, on certain things, there's such a consensus in the traditional scholarship that I cannot move away from it. But I can at the same time say that I'm no judge of your character. I can just tell you what the text say, what the teaching is. But I personally have no judgment against you. You're welcome to be, in my space and all of that. But to say that I can endorse it, do you understand the difference between I can accept you, but to endorse it, I cannot do as a scholar because the classical tradition doesn't allow it. So it's a very sensitive debate about, but going back to your question, how do you change but retain the core, that kind of issue.
But that's also very interesting, that I think often when it comes to sort of external judgments about religion, there's an assumption that it's very dichotomous. It's either you do this or you don't do it. But actually it's very interesting to hear that there are they're interpretations that can be tolerant of difference,
Exactly.
while
Completely.
not endorsing those differences.
Exactly. So that they're tolerating. They're saying we can, you can come in a mosque or not. But to say that I can endorse it for you and say Islam is fine with it, that's not my right, because the textual tradition doesn't allow for it. So that's the kind of position we take.
Very interesting. The next person with a question says, thank you for this really interesting presentation. Just two questions. First, what do you think about a survey that was done, I think, a few years ago by Gallup, that said people in places like Egypt wanted to live under so-called Sharia law, whilst Western Muslims did not adhere to this? Second, Yasir Qadhi has changed a lot in his thinking and approaches from extremely conservative to more progressive. What's your take on this? And again, I think it's worth sort of saying that when people ask, what's your take on this? They don't mean what's your opinion, they mean, how do you interpret this as a scholar?
Exactly. That's fine. So, see, with the Yasir Qadhi question, I can maybe take first, which is this, that he has progressed quite a bit in his views, but I put him up there because he's a very good example of how, scholars themselves can evolve. So he went to study in Saudi Arabia, initially took very conservative Salafi view, came back to his he was American, did eventually a PhD at Yale, and today is like a very moderate, I personally feel he's a very moderate voice today, which is a good thing. He progressed in his thought, he was open-minded. So it's an example where coming from a very close school of thought, the Salafism, you could adapt and change as long as you intellectually reflect. And he still uses the Salafi method. It's not that he's moved away from his method, but he's now using a lot of sort of reasoning to tell young Muslims that no, you can live in an Islam Western culture, you can be American Muslims and obey the law for these reasons. So do you understand? So I think that's a very good one, in my view, a good case to study how rigidity can adapt over time, if there's enough reflection and all. And about the first question about Alex, sorry, I get carried away with my thoughts, so I forget the question. What's the first one?
It was a question about, what do you think about a survey that...
Oh, yes, on that one, Alex, on that one, it's very interesting. This question always comes, and I, in fact, did under this project one survey with members of Islamic Muslim societies in UK and US, and we did the whole same probing about Sharia and how many want Sharia. The thing is that there's an idealism about Sharia. So if you ask Muslim anyway, even if you ask a Muslim, like I'm a born Muslim, I have to admit, not very living by it in my everyday life, but born Muslim. But the idea of Sharia growing up it's a very sort of it's very positive. Do you understand? Because you think of us early Muslim societies, you don't think of any contemporary Muslim society, Saudi Arabia or whatever, as living by true Sharia. So that's why. So a lot of research and even the surveys show that if you ask about do they live by Sharia, majority would say yes, because there's an idealism of Sharia. If you look at Al-Hamra, these very sort of grand palace in Granada, all of that. Muslims have a lot of this idea of this grand civilization, and that happened when empires were by Sharia. So do you understand? So a lot of, in fact, positive intellectual thought and all is linked to Sharia in their mind. So idealism is there, but if you ask them, contemporary Muslim governments can apply it, majority would say. The response goes down dramatically. You ask them, do you think it's possible for anyone to implement it today? Majority would say no. So do you understand? So this Gallup thing always has to be interpreted with cautious. What Muslims are saying is the idealism of Sharia. I mean, some people have been written about it, but whether they feel it can be implemented today, very rare. The percentage falls dramatically.
Very interesting. There's another question from Fakar Bilal. I'm not sure I can entirely understand the question, so I'm going to read it in the hope that you can. It says, how far is it relevant with the people who are in Islamic colleges, which you have mentioned, regarding authority with reference to experts of text, moral values, etc.? As one of your articles on Rawalpindi explains, it is very well, but how is the situation in the West? So I think the question is around, in terms of your analysis of Islamic colleges, are there differences in the way this opportunity for change plays out in Western contexts?
I think it depends. When you look at the Deoband tradition, the madrasa in Dewsbury or like some of the main sort of sites here, the cities where there are a lot of Muslims are as conservative, because I've visited some of them. As a woman, to enter them it's very difficult. There are very male spaces, a lot of gender segregation. So they're as difficult as very conservative madrasas in Pakistan. I've seen more open space, more progressive scholars in Deobandi madrasas in Pakistan. So when it comes to the core tradition, some of these institutions, the challenges, both sides are the same. Those who are orthodox and are wanting to live by that, challenges will be the same. But like I say, a lot of them are changing. Yasir Qadi, about which was asked, comes from one of the orthodox tradition, but has adapted so well in his reasoning. So I think there's not enough time, but if you look at the volumes, you can trace path of who are being resistant to change and why, and who are changing. So that's what the contribution, hopefully, of the volumes is.
Fantastic. Masooda, we are almost out of time, but there's one other issue I wanted to explore with you, which is your approach to social science. Because as someone who doesn't focus on Islam and the particular areas you focus on, your work is fascinating to me because of how you look, particularly at the relationship between ideas and interests and how they relate to power and identity. And these are some of the biggest themes in social science. And the way you look at them methodologically with a range of methods and approaches, ethnographic, interpretive, positivist and empirical, it's very inspiring methodologically. But I guess one of the challenges that many social scientists face is how methodologically you interpret whether an idea is doing the work to explain behavior and outcomes, or whether interests are explaining ideas and outcomes. How do you grapple when you observe behavior or change in Islam with separating different explanations for that change? When do you know an idea is doing the work, and when do you know it's an interest or a preference that's doing the work?
Very interesting, Alex. That's a very interesting question. And the immediate example that comes to my mind to help illustrate this argument, like how I've tried to do it, is the work from Rational Believer, where I was looking at a simple question about the female students. Why do they join a madrasa? Because the one argument is that, oh, they're going there purely for Islamic, otherworldly kind of rewards, because they get rewards in the other world. So it's a purely religious kind of conviction that's taking them. The other argument is that no, if you look at the population, a lot of them are socioeconomically from the marginalized section of the society, poor segments of the society. And for them, for a majority of them, upward education mobility is not possible. So, after a 10-year of education, higher education is not accessible, either parents cannot pay it, or in the immediate area, there's no option. So then in a way, it's a materialistic choice. Do you understand? So it's not one argument being it's purely a religious devotion issue. The other one is no, it's actually quite a calculated choice. You don't have good school education, so you go there. Apparently, when you interview girls in the madrasa, all will say, nobody would say I came here because there was no modern education available. They all will sound devout, that's my experience, all of that. So in that case, I would say that I, as a social scientist, I cannot know somebody's inside, what's the truth. But I do my social science work. I do this analysis of the context in which they're coming. And I say, no, there are other motives I can attribute to it. So I then give you both explanation, that it could be this or that. But how do I there are ways in which we can at times remove one side of the explanation and just focus on one, which is this, that I said, okay, fine. For this population, you can explain that it's not religious devotion. You can doubt it, and say maybe material interests are driving madrasa. Once you give them material interest, religion will disappear, that kind of argument. But then the thing is that they are also, I was at the same time able to find in the same societies very these Islamic scholarly platform for women who were from elite background. So, Muslim women of my background who come from, liberal circles in their home societies, have studied overseas, even that kind of profile. But Alex, they are joining some of these Islamic study circles, which are different than madrasas. Do you understand? They meet in elite hotels. They have all, they are doctors, they are professionals, all of that. But they're coming for the Islamic scholarship and living by an Islamic norm, they cover and all. So in that case, you say that the material interest as a social scientist, I can start eliminating a bit. Do you understand? And that's where I say they have no material apparent interest to come here. So in that case, then I focus much more on their reasoning. What is it that they find appealing about Islam? Because when the other girls tell me, oh, I find Islam appealing for this reason, it gives me this right, that right, there's a bit of doubt. She's just making it up because she's here because of lack of options. But with these women, I remove that doubt. So do you understand? So it's always a challenge. You can never be sure what people actually are from inside, but I think there are ways to eliminate in certain contexts some variables and focus on the other.
Masooda, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant and really enjoyable. Thank you for both the talk and for engaging with such a rich range of very diverse questions. It's been a pleasure to have you speak to Oxford Development Talks. And for everyone listening, thank you for joining us. Thank you for engaging. And the next Oxford Development Talks will be on Monday at 2 o'clock, and it will be Simukai Chigudu, who will speak on the politics of pandemics in Africa. From both of us, bye for now. Thanks, Masooda.
Thanks a lot, Alex, for hosting it. Thank you. Bye-bye.